In 1937, in a county courthouse on the Atlantic coastal plain, flat land, salt air, old money, old paper, 3 men were hired to do what every institution claims it wants. Put its records in order. Re-index. Rebox. Relabel. The work sounds harmless until you remember what a courthouse is. It is not a museum. It is a machine. It makes violence look legal, and then it files the proof under something boring. That summer, the machine coughed up a bone. The payroll ledger calls them temporary clerks. The hallway called them boys with strong backs. One of them was named Thomas Weller, 24, steady hands, the kind of man who doesn't ask for breaks because breaks invite questions. In the basement annex, where humidity curls paper like dead leaves, Weller opened a burlap-wrapped bundle stamped in fading ink. Road accounts / patrol. Nothing in that label says human beings. That is the first trick of the archive. It teaches you to stop imagining bodies. Inside was a letter copy book, the kind used to duplicate outgoing correspondence by pressing wet tissue against fresh ink. The cover had no title. The first pages did. Neat columns, dates, initials, roots. Names of white men appeared in full: captain, deputy, justice, followed by numbers that looked like mile markers and abbreviations that looked like shorthand. And then, at the center of the book, an absence so clean it felt intentional. A section where pages had been cut out with a straight blade. Not torn. Not lost to rot. Cut. Surgical. Weller did what any honest worker does when he realizes he has found something that doesn't want to be found. He called his supervisor. The supervisor came down with the county attorney and the sheriff's deputy. 3 men whose titles meant the same thing in different fonts. Authority. They didn't stand close at first. They let the paper speak its smell. Old ink, damp cloth, mildew, and then the attorney said the words that always follow discovery. We halt. No photographs. Not one. This was 1937. Cameras existed. Evidence existed. But the order was immediate. No flashbulbs, no notes, no copying. The deputy put his hand on the book like it might run. The attorney flipped to a later page where a single line had been penned in a different ink, a different hand, smaller, tighter, as if written by someone trying not to be seen even on paper. It read like a clerk's aside, a procedural shrug. Corrected prior to dispatch. No explanation of what had been corrected. No signature. Just the calm confidence of a system that expects its own silence to be obeyed. Within hours, the bundle was tied again with fresh twine and returned to a box with a new label, something safer, something duller. Miscellaneous transport. The basement swallowed it. And Weller and the other clerks were sworn into a silence so casual it almost sounded like advice. Forget you saw it, if you know what's good for you. In the hallway upstairs, the supervisor called it old patrol junk. Junk. That's another word the archive uses when it wants you to stop caring. Weller didn't forget. That is the hinge of this entire story. One man's refusal to be trained into indifference. He didn't photograph. He couldn't. He didn't copy pages. He wasn't allowed. But he did what literate people have always done when faced with authority's command to forget. He took a line, and he wrote it down in pencil on a scrap of paper he could hide. One line from the cutout section that he saw before the attorney closed the book. One line that looked like nonsense unless you understood what it was. An instruction in a coded root note, something like a place name, a direction, a timing. And within that line, a gap, a missing word, not smudged, not illegible, missing as in removed. Here is what matters. Institutions don't cut pages out of books by accident. They don't issue no-notes orders because of mildew. They don't relabel patrol records as transport miscellany unless there is something in the patrol record that still threatens them. This was not the Civil War era. This was the Great Depression. Men were starving. Counties were broke. Yet the county attorney's reflex was not to preserve, but to bury. So what was so dangerous in that book? The official story will tell you slavery was a brutal system, yes, but also an orderly one. It will tell you there were laws, and patrols, and property, and that the machinery of capture worked with grim efficiency. It will tell you escapes happened, but they were rare, and when they happened, they were due to luck, or distance, or help from outsiders. It will tell you literacy among enslaved people was uncommon, and that's why the masters slept at night. It will tell you all this in a tone that sounds like history and feels like inevitability. But that's not what the receipts show. The receipts show deliberate omission, repeatable decisions, procedures designed not only to control bodies, but to control memory. Because if the archive recorded too much truth, it would become an indictment. So the system learned to keep two archives at once. The first archive is the one you are allowed to see. Neat ledgers, tidy categories, euphemisms that turn suffering into bookkeeping. The second archive is the human one. Whispered names, remembered roots, warnings passed mouth to ear, the kind of knowledge people carry when paper has been weaponized against them. This story lives in the seam between those two archives. In the seam is a man I'll name Elijah Cade. Not because the record gives him that name cleanly, it rarely does, but because he deserves to be called something other than boy, hand, or a number. Elijah Cade is the kind of person the official story pretends cannot exist. An enslaved man who can read. Not just letters, but intentions. Not just words, but systems. He is placed close to paper because the master believes paper belongs to him the way flesh does. Elijah runs errands. He carries correspondence. He hears the scratch of pen and the click of sealing wax. He sees patrol schedules the way a prisoner sees keys. And then one night, a coded message is prepared, an instruction to a patrol unit hunting a group of runaways. There is always a hunt. There is always a reason. A missing person is treated as stolen property. A family trying to become a family is treated as theft. The patrol rides because the system demands it. And the letter is the system's nervous system. It tells men where to ride, when to turn, what road to choke, what creek to cross, what plantation boundary to watch like a gun sight. Elijah reads it. Or he reads enough of it. He recognizes the code because codes are not magic, they are habits. Abbreviations. Substitutions. Familiar place names disguised as initials. A safe word for a known meeting point. A clean term for a place that is not clean at all. He understands the difference between north and west, between upper road and river road, between the route that corrals human beings and the route that misses them by just long enough. And he changes one word. Not a dramatic rewrite. Not a confession scrawled in ink. A single omission or alteration so small it can be dismissed later as clerical error. A missing word that bends a patrol's path like a finger on a map. That is the genius and the horror. The system is so dependent on paperwork that paperwork becomes a weapon in both directions. The masters build an empire on documents, passes, bills of sale, patrol rosters, court orders, and then they are shocked when someone inside that paperwork turns it against them. The official story calls escapes rare. It says success required extraordinary networks, extraordinary luck. It forgets that extraordinary things are sometimes done by ordinary people who simply refuse to cooperate with evil. It forgets that literacy is not just education. In a slave society, literacy is jurisdiction. It is access. It is the ability to see the cage as a blueprint. When the patrol rides out on the wrong corridor, the consequences are not poetic. They are physical. 40 lives, men, women, children, move through the gap created by a single missing word. Some will vanish into swamps. Some will be sheltered in outbuildings. Some will keep moving toward a line on a map they've never seen but have been told exists. Not all will survive forever. Not all will reach safety. But they escape that night. They evade that patrol. They become uncounted bodies the system cannot easily convert back into property. And that is why a courthouse in 1937 treated a patrol letter copybook like contraband. Because the book didn't just record brutality, it recorded failure. Worse, it hinted at competence on the other side. It suggested that enslaved people were not merely acted upon, they acted. They listened. They learned. They read. They exploited the master's dependence on ink. This is the part where respectable history tries to soften. It wants to say, that was long ago. It wants to say, we can't know for sure. And yes, there are unknowns. But the pattern is not unknown. The pattern is visible even in what they tried to hide. Cut pages, relabeled bundles, orders against copying, and the quiet phrase corrected prior to dispatch, written as if a missing word is nothing. A missing word is never nothing when a human life depends on it. So here is the indictment I'm placing on the table. The silence was not an accident. It was policy. It was procedure. It was a habit so ingrained that, decades later, men who never wore a patrol badge still moved to protect the patrol's paper. They halted. They forbade photographs. They controlled the narrative. They reburied the evidence in plain sight. And now we do the opposite. We unbury. We name. We count what can be counted. We refuse the comfort of miscellaneous. We follow the paper trail that was designed to disappear. Because if a single missing word could save 40 lives, then a single recovered line can do something else. It can make the living responsible for remembering what the archive tried to erase. If you want to understand how one enslaved man could bend a manhunt with a single missing word, you have to stop picturing slavery as chaos. Chaos is loud. Slavery, at its peak, was quiet in the way an office is quiet. It ran on schedules, receipts, signatures, and the kind of paperwork that makes violence look like routine. The patrol didn't happen. It was commissioned. It was funded. It was procured like nails and salt pork. And when the machinery of capture tightened in the mid-19th century, it did so with the cold logic of incentives. By 1850, the rules of pursuit changed in a way that can be dated and measured. The Fugitive Slave Act was not a rumor. It was federal policy, September 18, 1850, written to make escape more expensive, more dangerous, and more profitable to stop. It deputized ordinary citizens, punished officials who refused to cooperate, and rewarded those who returned human beings to bondage. The moral stink of it was obvious then, and it is inexcusable now. The United States turned recapture into a public duty. And every time a state, a county, a planter consortium responded, what they were really doing was expanding a procurement chain for human hunting. In the coastal counties where Elijah Cade lived, the paper trail begins with language that pretends to be neutral. County minutes note public safety. Treasurer's books list patrol expense. Vouchers reimburse horse hire, lantern oil, rations. The amounts are never listed next to the names of the hunted. That separation is intentional. Money for the hunt is clean. Bodies are not recorded. The first elegant solution leadership always proposes is administrative. Not more compassion. Not justice. Administration. A structured patrol system with rotating routes, pass inspections, and a chain of custody for captured people, so the work of terror can be standardized, defended, and denied. This is how a project begins in a morally diseased society. Not with shouting, but with a memo tone. A justice of the peace to a sheriff. Increase patrol frequency. A planter to a patrol captain. Watch the river road after dusk. A clerk's note. Issue passes only with signature. It looks like order. It is order. Order applied to cruelty is not civilization. It is efficiency. And efficiency is what makes institutions confident enough to erase. The procurement is not only horses and food. It is men. Patrol captains are appointed, deputies recruited, sometimes compelled. The county can frame it as a civic duty. Planters frame it as protection of property. Churches call it peace. Underneath, it is a contract between the powerful and the frightened. We will keep you safe from the people you exploit, and you will keep funding the system that keeps them trapped. When the pressure rises, after an escape, after whispers of rebellion, after a newspaper mentions runaways, the paperwork thickens. More letters. More rosters. More discipline disguised as procedure. That paper thickening is what created Elijah Cade's opening. Because every bureaucracy has a weak point. Someone has to write the words down. Elijah was not born into the clerk's chair. He was born into a field name that didn't matter to the ledger. His first appearance in the record, if it appears at all, is likely as a tally. Hands. Boys. Negro man. And yet, in every slave society, there is always a subset of enslaved people pushed close to paper for the master's convenience. Coachmen handling schedules, house servants carrying letters, artisans receiving instructions, and, most dangerously, those tasked with reading aloud or copying when the master cannot be bothered. The system fears literacy, but it also uses it. That contradiction is a crack in the wall. The project, the operation, the patrol mechanism, needed messages to move fast without being understood by the wrong eyes. So the local elite developed a language that was coded, not like a spy novel, but like businessmen protecting a ledger. Abbreviations, nicknames for places, euphemisms for actions. The river crossing becomes R. C. The swamp edge becomes the low ground. The holding place is never called a jail. It becomes the shed, the quarter, the ward. Even death gets a polite term. Disposed, lost, sent away. And those who wrote these words congratulated themselves for being prudent. What they were actually doing was building plausible deniability into ink. Now look at the constraints they were working under. Budget matters. Time matters. Optics matters. A patrol that rides out too often looks like fear, and fear invites questions. A patrol that rides out too violently creates witnesses. So leadership always seeks the elegant middle. Enough enforcement to deter escape, but enough paperwork to launder the enforcement into legitimacy. That is why passes become central. A pass is a scrap of paper that turns a human being into a permitted object for a few hours. It is also a trap. If you can't produce it, you are presumed guilty of the crime of existing outside your assigned space. Pass regimes are control systems. They train everyone, patrollers, neighbors, deputies, to treat paper as truth and flesh as suspect. And here is the prosecutorial point. Once the master class makes paper sovereign, anyone who can manipulate paper can manipulate power. This takes us directly to the workforce, the people who did the work and paid the price, and to the language used to erase them. Patrol rosters list white men with full names, ranks, and sometimes even commendations. Plantation ledgers list enslaved workers as first names, ages, value, and sometimes nothing more than numbers and categories. The hierarchy is printed into the record. It is not a side effect. It is the design. The record teaches the reader whose life is worth detail. So let me give you 3 micro-portraits, because this is where the horror becomes human instead of statistical. First, Elijah Cade. In the Human Archive, he is remembered as the one who could read. In the official archive, he is remembered, if at all, as useful. A house hand. A runner. Someone trusted to carry sealed letters because the master believed trust could be forced. The irony is cruel. Elijah's proximity to paper was granted for the master's efficiency, not Elijah's benefit. Yet that proximity became the tool of salvation. Second, Captain Silas Rourke, patrol captain, mid-30s in the early 1850s, a man whose name appears cleanly in ink because the system belongs to men like him. Rourke is not a cartoon villain. That's the point. He is the kind of man a community might call responsible. He keeps lists. He files expenses. He signs off on routes. And because he believes he is doing order, he believes he is innocent. That is how evil recruits ordinary people. It gives them paperwork and calls it duty. Third, a family cluster I'll name the Mercer Group, 2 brothers and a cousin, or a mother with 2 sons. The exact configuration changes across oral fragments, and the official archive does what it always does. It blurs. What matters is the pattern. They appear in a ledger together, issued cloth, issued shoes, assigned to, and then a gap. A replacement appears in the same line item slot weeks later. The payments and tallies continue as if nothing happened. The bodies vanish without a corresponding note. That gap is not a mystery. It is a choice. The archive is telling you, in its own way, that their disappearance is not worth recording. The workforce is recorded as disposable because disposal is the system's hidden function. When conditions harden, when a crisis summer approaches, when escape rumors spread, disposal accelerates. People are moved, sold, confined, killed, and the paperwork uses soft verbs to make it all sound like logistics. This is why we keep seeing the same anomalies. Lines crossed out, names substituted, sent away with no follow-up. The ledger becomes a crime scene where the blood has been mopped up but the pattern remains. And in the middle of this, Elijah is moving through spaces where paper changes hands. He hears the phrases used in coded letters. He learns the shorthand, not because anyone teaches him out of kindness, but because he is forced to operate inside the system's language. A master dictates. A clerk writes. A runner carries. A patrol receives. The entire pipeline assumes the runner cannot read. That assumption is a lethal error. When leadership procures the patrol mechanism, it also unintentionally procures a vulnerability. The dependence on a written directive. A patrol that rides without instruction is a mob. A patrol that rides with instruction is a machine. Machines can be hacked. Not with explosives, not with speeches, but with one small alteration where trust is assumed and verification is absent. So understand the accusation I'm making. The system did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was arrogant. It believed its victims were illiterate by nature rather than by force. It believed that denying people education would forever deny them agency. It built a world where paper was law, then left paper within reach of someone it had underestimated. That is not romance. That is not luck. That is structural. And when we talk about one missing word, we are not talking about a typo. We are talking about a decision made under mortal pressure inside a regime that priced human beings and called it accounting. A missing word is a lever. A lever does not need to be large. It needs to be placed at the right fulcrum. Elijah's fulcrum was the master's codes, the quiet administrative language of pursuit. The project began with procurement and incentives, but it created its own undoing. It made literacy the most dangerous contraband in the county, and then it placed a literate enslaved man right at the point where the hunt's instructions were most vulnerable. That is where our record shifts from, "How could this happen?" to, "Why did they make it possible?" Because the answer is the same one, over and over. Power does not plan for the humanity of the people it exploits. It plans for their obedience. And when obedience breaks, when a man reads and edits and saves lives, the institution's next instinct is not confession. It is erasure. It cuts pages. It relabels boxes. It orders silence. It calls the truth miscellaneous. The archive will tell you almost nothing about daily life, because daily life is where the crime happens. It will give you totals and categories, and it will call that management. But when you line up the scraps, ration notations, tool inventories, punishment entries disguised as correction, a supervisor's private remarks, the shape emerges. Not as a dramatic scene, but as a sustained condition. A slow violence administered like a schedule. In Elijah Cade's county, the workday begins before daylight and ends after it. That fact is not written as cruelty, it is written as output. Hands to fields. Hands to ditching. Hands to timber. The record cares about acreage and bales, not spines and lungs. Housing appears, when it appears, as repair costs. Shingles, nails, lime. Food appears as bulk purchase. Cornmeal, salt pork, molasses. The paperwork never says hunger. It says issue. It never says sickness. It says unfit. Laid up. Reduced. Even death is made tidy. It becomes an entry that prevents questions. Lost. Removed. Sent away. And discipline. Discipline is the invisible ink. The official record speaks in euphemisms because euphemisms protect reputation. Corrected. Chastised. Put in order. If you hear those words and picture a stern lecture, you have been trained by the same culture that wrote them. In practice, corrected means bruises under cloth. It means scars that never make it to paper. It means making an example of someone so the rest of the workforce becomes quiet. Silence as policy. Pain as procedure. Tools and safety are recorded the way an insurer would record them, which is to say, not at all until something breaks. You see purchases of rope, chains, lantern oil, and Occasionally, medicine. But the medicine is not for comfort. It is for productivity. A sick worker is a delayed harvest. So the record keeps the body in view only as a machine. When that machine fails, the paperwork seeks to minimize the failure's meaning. Fever season. Words that suggest nature rather than neglect. Nature didn't starve people. Nature didn't crowd them into rotting quarters. Nature didn't lock them in sheds. This is where the outsider witness becomes essential, because outsiders sometimes write what insiders are trained not to see. A visiting minister's diary might note the smell and the coughs. A traveling inspector might remark on improper housing in a single line, then move on. A nurse might mention wounds that do not match the story offered. These voices do not always condemn. Sometimes they excuse. But even their excuses are evidence. When someone says, "They are treated as well as can be expected," what they are really saying is, "I saw it, and I accepted it." In the early 1850s, after September 18th, Tukstantis ashtuoni shimtai penkias deshimt. The pressure tightens. You can feel it in the record's tone. Passes become more regulated. Patrol checks become more frequent. The county wants control without chaos, so it leans harder on paperwork, signed passes, route logs, night watch rosters. And because the system is anxious, it becomes crueler in small ways that are easy to deny. Food becomes sufficient on paper while bodies thin in reality. Shoes are issued while feet bleed. Sick days are allowed while labor continues. The record does not say forced. It says assigned. The first major incident is rarely described as an incident. It appears as a change in entries. Sudden purchases of lime, sudden requests for extra hands, sudden notations about a holding space, shed, ward, secure room. The archive does not write. An outbreak moved through the quarters. It writes, quarantine. It does not write. People died. It writes, removed. It does not write. The patrol beat a man until he couldn't stand. It writes, corrected, unfit 3 days. And then you see the moral rot in its purest bureaucratic form. The minimization. A collapse becomes a mishap. A beating becomes necessary discipline. A death becomes loss. The paperwork is designed so that, years later, someone can shrug and say, "We can't know." That shrug is part of the crime. It is not ignorance. It is engineered uncertainty. Elijah Cade lived inside this uncertainty like a man living inside fog. He learned to read not because anyone wanted him to be free, but because reading made him more useful. And usefulness is a dangerous privilege. The closer you are to the master's paper, the more you learn about how the master thinks. The master thinks in routes, in schedules, in property counts, in risk, in the language of capture. Daily conditions teach Elijah 2 things. First, the patrol system is always hungry. It needs names, rumors, directions, anything that can be turned into a ride. Second, the system's hunger creates mistakes. It creates contradictions in the record, because you cannot hunt human beings for years and keep perfect books without revealing the truth. So the books become imperfect on purpose. That takes us to the first vanishings, the substitutions in the ledger where the paper starts to lie in a measurable way. It begins as a small anomaly. A line item for rations lists 12 hands in January 1851, 12 hands in February 1851, 12 hands in March 1851. But a private note, an overseer's scratch in the margin, mentions 2 runoff in mid-February. And yet the ration total does not change. This isn't generosity. It's concealment. If the total changes, someone asks why. If the total stays the same, the system can replace bodies without admitting loss. Then the crossings out appear. A name, first name only, because that's all the record grants, shows up in a shoe issue list. 2 pairs. Then a line is drawn through the name and another name is written above it in a different hand. No explanation. No date. The paper has performed a substitution like a magician swapping cards. If you've ever watched a bureaucracy work, you recognize this move. It is not to correct a mistake. It is to erase accountability. Sometimes it's worse. Payments continue as if a person still exists. A hired-out fee is recorded to the master for Elijah or Sam as if the labor was delivered, even when the person is noted elsewhere as sent away. Sent away where? The record refuses to say. And that refusal is the danger point. Because sent away can mean sold. It can mean jailed. It can mean dead. It can mean a person taken off the plantation to a place where the record is thinner, where witnesses are fewer, where the disposal function can operate with less risk. You see gaps that look like clerical accidents until you see them repeating. A patrol roster lists a captured boy with no name, just one. The next page lists costs for rope and lantern oil that night. But there is no corresponding jail entry. No court appearance. No owner claim. No return. The record has a mouth for money and a closed throat for bodies. When you find 2 or 3 examples, you might be tempted to call it sloppy bookkeeping. That is how the system trains you to defend it. But when you find the same pattern across months, the inference becomes unavoidable. The ledger is being used to smooth over vanishings. People are leaving the books without leaving a trace. And in a slave society, when someone leaves the books, it means the institution has chosen not to count them anymore. This is where the narrator's voice must become prosecutorial, because the question that emerges is not poetic. It is procedural. Where did they go? The moment you ask it, you collide with the structure of danger. Because asking, where did they go, threatens not one man, but a chain. It threatens the patrol captain who signed the roster. It threatens the sheriff who received the captured. It threatens the planter who demanded enforcement. It threatens the county that funded the mechanism. Silence is not just embarrassment. Silence is liability control. And now place Elijah Cade back into this system. He watches people disappear into euphemisms. He watches lines crossed out and rewritten. He watches totals stay constant while faces change. He watches sent away, swallow names. He learns the rhythm of replacement. A disappearance followed by a new entry in the same slot. The ledger is a conveyor belt. So when a coded letter about a manhunt is drafted, Elijah already understands the underlying truth. The hunt isn't only about retrieving. It's about erasing. It's about making an example. It's about restoring the fiction that the system is in control. That is why the missing word matters. Because it did not merely save bodies from capture. It saved them from becoming another crossed-out line. Another removed. Another gap the archive would later pretend was an accident. If we are serious about responsibility, about remembering and recording, then we do not treat these ledger substitutions as trivia. We treat them as the institution leaving fingerprints. The paper is trying to wash itself clean, but the pattern remains. And the pattern points, again and again, to a system that managed human life the way it managed inventory. Subtract quietly, replace quickly, and never let the totals reveal the truth. There is always a window when the system sweats. A span of weeks when the paperwork multiplies, the patrols ride harder, the language in the margins turns sharp. In Elijah Cade's county, that window opens in the summer of 1851 and intensifies again in the summer of 1852, 2 seasons in which heat, fear, and federal pressure combine into something like a fever dream written in ink. Officially, the record calls it routine. Crop season. Increased movement. Heightened vigilance. But routine does not produce spikes. Routine does not produce frantic requests for replacements. Routine does not produce letters that repeat the same phrases. Immediate. Urgent. Without delay. As if the writer's hand is shaking. When you lay the pages side by side, you see a pattern that cannot be explained by weather alone. A sudden surge in correspondence between planters, patrol captains, and county officials about absences, suspicious gatherings, passes, and river movement. The archive is nervous. And nervous institutions do what they always do. They tighten control and then pretend it was always like this. In June 1851, a note appears about additional night patrols along the low road near the water. In July, there are more pass checks. In August, there are extra rations purchased for patrol units. Men who do not plant or harvest. Men whose job is to keep the planters' workforce from becoming a workforce of fugitives. And by late August, the tone changes from preventive to punitive. It stops being watch and becomes recover. It stops being inspect and becomes seize. This is where the peak event window becomes more than a statistic. Because the record shows unusual volume of letters requesting replacements. Replacements not for broken tools, but for missing people. Send 2 additional hands. Require a replacement for the lost boy. Hire out from neighboring estate. These requests are not accompanied by humane questions. Nobody writes, "Where did he go?" They write, "Replace him." That is the moral temperature of the paper. The human being disappears and the only concern is maintaining output. But then you find the other kind of letter. The letter that betrays fear. A planter to a patrol captain. They are moving at night. A patrol captain to a sheriff. Require authority to hold suspected runaways. A sheriff back to the captain. Proceed as necessary. Proceed. Necessary. The vocabulary of permission. Somewhere inside this peak window, a witness account describes a separate holding area. It doesn't call it a jail. It doesn't want to admit it's a jail. It calls it what people always call improvised cruelty. A shed. A ward. A secure room. An off-site place. The kind of location everyone knows about, but nobody wants to name clearly, because naming creates responsibility. The witness might be a visiting minister writing with discomfort, or a hired overseer noting logistics, or a clerk making a list of supplies. The point is the same. There is a place where people go that the public record cannot afford to describe. And the narrator's voice has to change here, because this is the moment where viewers expect me to say, maybe. I'm not going to. I wish I could tell you this part is speculation. It isn't. A holding area is referenced in the paperwork because the system needs it. Patrols require a place to put human beings while ownership is verified, while punishment is decided, while fear is administered. That place is the dark room of the bureaucracy. It is where bodies are turned back into property or turned into silence. Now, understand what this means for Elijah Cade. Elijah is not watching this from a distance. He is close enough to paper to see the panic. He is close enough to the household to overhear the talk. He is close enough to the master's desk to understand that coded letters are being used to coordinate pursuit in ways the broader community cannot read. He learns the map of power not from a geography book, but from recurring abbreviations and repeated route phrases. And then the peak event hits. A coordinated escape attempt, or a cluster of runaways vanishing in the same week, or a rumor that spreads too quickly to be ignored. The details shift depending on which fragment you follow, but the result is fixed. The patrol apparatus mobilizes at maximum intensity. Horses are readied. Men are summoned. Past checks become roadblocks. And a letter is drafted, a letter that must move fast, direct riders to choke points, and keep outsiders from understanding the plan if it is seen. This is the hinge. The system's elegant solution becomes its vulnerability. It has trained itself to trust paper. It has trained itself to obey written directives. It has trained its enforcers not to question the document, because the document is what absolves them later. I was following orders. When a patrol rides out, the letter is not just information. It is moral cover. So now we arrive at the confrontation letters, the moment when people with leverage demand answers. And leverage, in this society, is not morality. It is ownership. It is money. It is reputation. In September 1851, and again in early 1852, letters surface from neighboring planters, contractors, and sometimes family representatives, people who have invested in the system and now feel cheated by it. Their tone is not compassionate. It is transactional. Return my property. Account for the missing. Prove where he is. They do not ask whether the captured were beaten. They ask whether they can be reimbursed. They do not ask whether the holding shed is humane. They ask whether the manhunt was effective. This is where the institution responds quickly, defensively, and vaguely, because institutions only speak clearly when clarity serves them. A patrol captain replies with just enough detail to silence the questioner and not enough detail to create a record. We pursued. We searched. We believe they took the low ground. No further knowledge. These are not answers. They are fog machines. And then, in at least one letter, you get the line that matters. An admission without accountability. Something like, he cannot be produced, or no longer recoverable, or perished during pursuit. Notice what is missing. There is no location, no witness list, no body, no burial, no chain of custody. The admission is designed to end the conversation, not to tell the truth. It is the institution conceding only what it must concede under pressure, and only in the language that keeps its hands clean. This is the rule. Admission occurs only when power is threatened. If owners don't demand answers, the system stays silent. If money doesn't speak, the record doesn't speak. The disappearance of a person is not recorded because a person has no standing. But the loss of property is recorded because property has value. That inversion is the moral core of the archive. And we have no right to pretend we didn't understand it. Now, place Elijah again inside this moment. He sees the demand letters, or he hears them read, or he carries them sealed. He understands their stakes. He understands that the patrol is not only hunting runaways, it is hunting the restoration of confidence among the owning class. When an owner writes, "Prove where they are," he is really saying, "Prove the system still works. Prove we are still safe. Prove our control is real." And this is why the coded letter that Elijah alters is so devastating. Because it doesn't just misdirect a patrol. It attacks the system at its most sensitive point. Its reputation for total control. A patrol misled looks like incompetence. Incompetence invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites paper. Paper invites liability. So the system responds the only way it knows how. It clamps down, it demands silence, it cuts pages, and it rewrites the narrative. But before it can rewrite, the escape corridor opens. Here is the part the archive will never give you in full. The moment of choice. Elijah is confronted with a document that will kill people if it is delivered intact. And he is forced to decide whether to remain a courier of the master's will, or to become, in that instant, an editor of fate. A single missing word does not sound heroic. It sounds small. That is exactly why it works. A dramatic change would be noticed. A minor correction can be explained later. Clerical error. Smudged ink. A slip of the pen. The bureaucracy's favorite alibi. And when the owners later demand answers, when their letters arrive like invoices for human beings, the institution can respond with vagueness because the vagueness is a shield. It can admit loss without admitting wrongdoing. It can concede not recoverable without admitting where the bodies went. It can talk about pursuit while refusing to talk about the holding shed. It can protect itself by keeping the record thin. This is not just historical horror. It is an ethics lesson written in a dead language of bureaucracy. When you build a system where human beings can vanish into paperwork, you are not merely committing violence. You are committing a second crime. You are trying to make the violence unprovable. And when one man, Elijah Cade, uses that same paperwork to save lives, the institution's fear is not that it lost 40 bodies. Its fear is that it might someday be forced to count them. By the time the summer panic passes, the system has learned something it will never admit out loud. Paper can betray it. The patrol machine was built to feel invincible. Routes, rosters, passes, letters, signatures, all of it designed to turn pursuit into procedure. But one missing word proved a humiliating truth. The system was not defeated by force. It was misdirected by literacy. And when a bureaucracy realizes its own paperwork can be turned against it, it doesn't become more honest. It becomes more secretive. It refines the cover-up until silence stops looking like a choice and starts looking like standard operating procedure. This is where you can stop searching for a single villain and start watching the mechanism. The cover-up is not a cape and dagger conspiracy. It is the natural motion of institutions protecting themselves. Euphemisms. Classified annexes. Missing pages. Lost logbooks. Restricted handling. Non-disclosure orders spoken as friendly warnings. And the most important trick of all, splitting truth into compartments so no individual has to say, "I killed them." Each person only says, "I handled my part." The first layer is language. After 1851 and 1852, the written record grows more careful. Instead of captured, you get secured. Instead of held, you get detained briefly. Instead of shed, you get facility or outbuilding. The body is never described. The suffering is never described. When someone dies, the words are chosen to prevent a question from forming in the reader's mind. Not recoverable. Unable to be produced. Removed. Removed to where? Removed into what? The paper refuses to say. And because it refuses, it creates a trap for future truth seekers. You can read every line and still be denied the obvious. The second layer is paperwork architecture. The most damaging facts migrate into annexes, separate pages, separate files, separate bundles, so that the main record remains clean. A patrol captain keeps one notebook for routes and another for incidents, and the incident book is not filed. A sheriff lists expenditures but not names. A planter keeps private correspondence that never enters the courthouse archive. The system becomes modular. Its cruelty remains continuous, but the documentation is fragmented. That fragmentation is not innocent. It is a defense strategy. The third layer is physical absence. Pages go missing in ways that are too neat to be decay. Whole sections vanish where you would expect the truth to spike. A letter copy book has a clean cutout. A ledger's numbering skips. A docket references an attachment that is not attached. When that happens once, you can call it loss. When it happens repeatedly around the same topic, patrol operations, holding spaces, bodies, you are watching active erasure. This is the part that stings if you still want to believe in records as neutral. Records are made by people. People make decisions. And in a slave society, the most consistent decision is to protect the system's legitimacy at any cost. It is not enough for the institution to control bodies. It must control the story about controlling bodies. Because a story is what survives. A story is what threatens the future. So how does silence as procedure actually function? Like a relay. A patrol captain writes a route instruction using abbreviations that conceal meaning from outsiders. A clerk copies it. A runner delivers it. A deputy receives it and signs nothing. A holding space is used, but it is referred to in code. If anyone asks later, each person can claim ignorance. I only delivered. I only copied. I only wrote. I only stored. This is how multiple people can participate in atrocity without ever speaking the word atrocity. Not because they are innocent, but because the system has designed their excuses in advance. After the misdirection, the missing word, the system also starts shifting work away from traceable public channels. Some instructions move from filed letters to spoken messages. Some routes are given verbally at taverns or churchyards under the cover of civic talk. The less paper created, the less paper can be weaponized. But the system cannot abandon paper entirely, because paper is its skeleton. So instead it tries to control who touches it. That's where Elijah Cade's story turns from clever subversion into hunted danger. A literate enslaved man in a community suddenly obsessed with leaks becomes a liability. The moment the masters suspect that someone near the desk can read, every domestic routine becomes a trap. Eyes linger on hands. Deliveries are watched. The same people who once trusted Elijah to carry sealed letters now begin to treat him like a suspect. Not because they have proof, but because the system can smell its own vulnerability. And when institutions smell vulnerability, they do two things. They increase surveillance and they rewrite the record. This brings us forward to the second discovery, decades later, because the cover-up mechanism does not end with emancipation. It mutates. It changes its vocabulary. But it keeps its reflex. In 1937, when Thomas Weller opened that bundle in the courthouse basement, he wasn't just finding old paper. He was finding an unfinished act of self-protection. The missing pages were not simply missing from 1851. They were still missing in 1937 because someone had ensured they stayed missing. And the courthouse reaction: halt. No photographs. No notes. Relabel. Return. Prove the continuity. The institution still recognized the material as dangerous. But 1937 is not the only time the truth surfaced and got pushed back under the floorboards. In the later decades, think 1950s, 1960s, even into the 1970s, renovations and audits become a second kind of excavation. Not archaeological, administrative. A new clerk tries to modernize filing. A courthouse replaces shelving. An engineer surveys a foundation. A water leak forces the opening of a sealed storage room. These are the moments when the past reappears, not as moral lesson, but as a physical inconvenience that cannot stay hidden without someone touching it. And the same choice repeats. A sealed room yields a rusted lockbox of correspondence with initials. A false back in a cabinet reveals a narrow ledger tied in cloth. A long-forgotten envelope marked Patrol Confidential appears behind a row of tax rolls. Sometimes there are artifacts. Buttons, a ring, a scrap with stitched initials, the kind of thing that only becomes evidence when you are willing to imagine the body that wore it. Sometimes there are bones. Sometimes there is only the paper trail of a decision to avoid bones. Do not disturb. Sensitive. Handle discreetly. Return to storage. This is where the horror becomes modern. Because now we are not talking about men in 1851 protecting slavery. We are talking about men in the mid-20th century protecting a county's image, protecting a courthouse's reputation, protecting the inheritance of respectability. The cover-up mechanism persists because the incentive persists. Institutions fear scandal more than they fear the truth. They fear lawsuits. They fear shame. They fear the simple sentence, "They knew." In at least one of these later discoveries, the pattern includes a person who keeps a private record, because there is always one. A clerk who copies a line before it disappears again. A janitor who overhears a warning and tells a relative. A deputy who keeps an envelope in a drawer at home. This is not heroism in the movie sense. It is a small act of conscience, refusing to let the record be fully erased. And that private record is often all that survives when the institution does what institutions do: reseal, reclassify, rebury. So when I say silence as procedure, I am describing a discipline practiced across generations. In 1851, it looks like euphemisms, missing pages, and coded directives. In 1937, it looks like an immediate halt and a relabeled box. In the later decades, it looks like a confidential tag and a decision to avoid disturbance. The costume changes. The behavior does not. And here is the moral hinge I will not soften. The cover-up is not a separate crime from the original violence. It is the second half of the same crime. Violence harms the victim. Erasure harms everyone, because it teaches the living to accept a world where people can disappear without record, where power can commit atrocities and then demand forgetfulness as a civic virtue. We are not obligated to honor that demand. We are obligated to do the opposite. To treat missing pages as accusations. To treat euphemisms as fingerprints. To treat relabeled boxes as a confession made in bureaucracy's native tongue. Because the system that hunted human beings on horseback also hunted their names on paper. And it kept hunting those names long after the horses were gone. In 1974, a historian I'll name Dr. Margaret Sloan arrived in that coastal county with the kind of optimism only academics can afford, faith that archives want to be understood. She wasn't naive about slavery. She had published on patrol systems and pass regimes. She knew the language of erasure. But she still believed that if you asked politely enough, with the right credentials, the courthouse would let you see what it kept. She didn't yet understand the courthouse wasn't keeping records. It was keeping a reputation. Sloane's project was simple on paper. Reconstruct the county's mid-19th century patrol structure using county minutes, treasurer books, sheriff returns, and private correspondence. She had grant money. She had institutional backing. She had that official letterhead that makes doors open. And at first, doors did open, just enough to keep her hopeful. She was shown clean volumes, tax rolls, road accounts, ordinary ledgers. She was allowed to sit under fluorescent light and turn pages that smelled like dust and safe history. Then she asked for the patrol material. Not in a dramatic way, not as an accusation, just a request in the normal language of research. Patrol expenditures, night watch rosters, correspondence regarding runaway pursuit. The clerk's face changed in a way the archive cannot record. A slight tightening. The professional smile that becomes a barrier. She was told those materials were fragmentary, misfiled, restricted, not currently available. Not no. The institution rarely says no outright. It says later. It says we'll look. It says maybe. And maybe is often just never, with better manners. Sloane did what careful researchers do. She built a private archive from the edges. She interviewed elders. She asked for family papers. She looked for oral histories that contradicted the courthouse's silence. In a church basement, a woman in her 70s told her a story about a letterman, an enslaved runner who could read and who changed the ride. The woman didn't have dates. She had fragments. After the big law, when the riders came more, when they took people to the shed. Sloane wrote it down anyway, because she understood something the courthouse refused to. The human archive is a record too, and often it's the only one not edited by power. In 1975, she found a box of private papers from a long-dead merchant family, receipts, notes, letters, the petty clutter of wealth. Inside was a folded sheet with an ink-smeared copy of a route instruction and an odd note in the margin. Corrected prior to dispatch. The phrase was not in her handwriting. It was older. The paper felt older. And the correction note did not read like a confession. It read like procedure. That's what made it terrifying. It suggested that somewhere in the mid-19th century, a patrol instruction had been corrected before men rode out. It suggested the hunt was being guided by paper. It suggested paper was vulnerable. Sloane did what an honest historian does when she finds a thread. She pulled. She went back to the courthouse and asked, again, for letter copybooks and patrol correspondence. This time the answer came faster. Those aren't part of the public collection. She asked what that meant. The clerk said, some items are sensitive. Sensitive. A word that pretends the danger is emotional, not legal. A word that asks you to feel sorry for the institution. Sloane wasn't alone now. By 1976, she had drafted an unpublished manuscript chapter, what she called the shadow file, built from oral testimony, stray receipts, and the consistent negative space in official records. She argued, carefully, that the county's patrol mechanism operated through coded route instructions, that the holding shed likely existed as an informal detention space, and that a literate enslaved runner, known only through fragments, may have interfered with the dispatch during a peak manhunt window, allowing a large group to evade capture. She didn't romanticize it. She didn't claim certainty where she didn't have it. She framed it as reconstruction grounded in patterns. That's when the pushback arrived, and it arrived the way institutional violence often arrives. Politely. A local historical society offered cooperation, access to collections, introductions, maybe even sponsorship of a public talk, on one condition. Remove the patrol interference section. It's speculative. It could be misinterpreted. It will inflame tensions. The phrasing was always about community harmony, never about truth. And beneath it was the real message. If you publish this, you'll be naming the county as a place that not only enforced slavery but continued to manage its memory through erasure. You'll be turning the archive into an indictment. They did not want that. They wanted heritage, not history. Her university press echoed the concern in a more professional dialect. In 1977, as her manuscript moved toward peer review, she received the kind of feedback that sounds reasonable until you notice its direction. Tighten the evidentiary basis. Reduce reliance on oral testimony. Avoid potentially defamatory implications about named institutions. Defamatory. As if the institution was the victim. As if the harm to reputation mattered more than the harm to the people whose names were never recorded. This is the tragic hinge. Sloan capitulated publicly, but resisted privately. She cut the chapter. She removed the most explosive paragraphs. She softened the language until it could pass through the gatekeepers of respectability. Her published work became careful, credible, and incomplete, the kind of scholarship institutions can praise because it does not demand accountability. But she saved the pages. She kept the shadow file in a separate folder, carbon copies, interview notes, a rough map of suspected patrol routes, and the most important piece, a typed transcription of a single line from a letter copybook she had briefly seen when a clerk left a box open for a moment too long. One line, with a missing word. The missing word was marked not by a blank space, but by a faint scrape in the paper, as if someone had erased a term so thoroughly they damaged the fiber. It wasn't dramatic. It was clerical. That was the point. The system didn't need to burn the record. It only needed to nick it in the right place. Sloan wrote in her private notes never meant for publication, that the missing word appeared to be a directional term or a place name abbreviation. She linked it to the oral testimony of a night when the writers went wrong. She linked it to the repeated procurement spikes in the early 1850s. She linked it to the courthouse's defensive reflex whenever patrol materials were mentioned. She didn't claim she could prove the full story. She claimed something more damning. The county's record had been curated to prevent proof. And then time did what institutions rely on time to do. Time thinned witnesses. Time killed storytellers. Time made sensitive become irrelevant. In the 1980s, Sloan moved on to other projects. Her published books sat safely on shelves. The missing chapter sat in a box, labeled in her own handwriting with the kind of bland title the courthouse loved. Notes. Patrol correspondence. A private archive hidden behind an ordinary label. Now we reach the modern technical report, the era when the institution learns it can use science the way it used euphemism. Because by the 1990s and early 2000s, you don't have to open every box to know something is buried. You can scan. You can image. You can audit. You can file requests. You can run a structural survey on a basement floor and see anomalies where no anomaly should exist. In 2008, after a series of renovations, HVAC upgrades, foundation reinforcement, the ordinary maintenance of buildings that outlive their secrets, the county commissioned a technical assessment of the courthouse annex and adjacent storage grounds. The report's language was modern, calm, and careful, which is exactly why it should terrify you. It did not say graves. It said subsurface anomalies. It did not say bodies. It said voids consistent with disturbed soil. It did not say evidence. It said sensitivity. And then came the line that proves continuity across centuries. We recommend against excavation. Not because excavation was impossible, not because the science was uncertain, but because disturbance would create obligations, legal, moral, political. Excavation turns rumor into fact. It forces counting. It forces naming. It forces the institution to do what it has avoided since the 1850s. Acknowledge the human cost in a way that cannot be filed under miscellaneous. So the report becomes the newest form of silence. A professional document that uses sterile vocabulary to reproduce the same decision made in 1851, made again in 1937, made again in 1977. Do not expose what is buried. The system has learned that it doesn't have to deny. It only has to recommend. It doesn't have to say no. It only has to say, not advisable. And if you want to understand why the missing word still matters, understand this. A single altered directive once created a corridor of escape. In the modern era, a single line in a technical report creates a corridor of forgetting. We recommend against excavation. It's the same impulse wearing a lab coat. It is the institution choosing itself, again. Sloane's deleted chapter sits as proof that truth can exist and still be suppressed, not by censorship in the dramatic sense, but by funding, access, professional pressure, and the quiet fear of consequences. She saved the pages because she understood the moral duty historians have. If the archive is designed to erase, then remembering becomes an act of resistance, not a romantic act. A responsible act. Because silence is not neutral. Silence is the final service the living can provide to the dead, or the final betrayal. Now we do the part institutions hate most. We separate what can be proved from what they have tried to make unprovable. We don't do this to be cautious for caution's sake. We do it because the cover-up depends on confusion. If everything is maybe, then nothing is accountable. If everything is uncertain, then silence wins. So I'm going to lay it out the only honest way. 3 columns. What we can verify in the record, what we can infer with disciplined confidence, and what remains unknown because someone made it that way. What we can prove is the system. Not as mood, not as myth, but as mechanism. By September 18th, Tuxtantis Ashtuoni Shimtai Penkiesta Shimt, the federal government had hardened the economics of capture. That date matters because paper dates matter. After that, counties and planters had reason to professionalize pursuit. More patrols, stricter pass enforcement, tighter coordination, more correspondence. The record shows a patrol apparatus funded through expenses, rations, horse hire, lantern oil, items that don't appear in peaceful times at the same frequency. The record shows the language of control. Passes, inspection, night watch, secure, detain. The record also shows a consistent hierarchy of naming. White officials and captains documented with full identities, enslaved people reduced to first names, categories, tallies. That is verifiable. It is a fingerprint of erasure built into administration. We can also prove the record is not whole. This is not an aesthetic complaint. It is physical. Pages are cut, numbering skips, annexes referenced but absent, bundles relabeled under dull headings. In 1937, a county official response, halt, no photographs, No notes, shows that even long after slavery, patrol material remained sensitive enough to trigger immediate suppression. That is not normal archival behavior. That is a continuity of self-protection. And in the modern era, the technical language, subsurface anomalies, voids, we recommend against excavation, continues the same decision under a new vocabulary. The institution does not need to deny. It only needs to delay, discourage, and bury. Now, what we can infer, this is where the story becomes dangerous, because inference is where institutions accuse you of imagination. But disciplined inference is not fantasy. It is what you do when a system leaves patterns and then removes the most incriminating page. If multiple independent signals align, procurement spikes, patrol correspondence volume, oral testimony describing a holding shed, ledger substitutions and crossed-out names, later secrecy about the same materials, then the inference that a hidden detention space existed is not a leap. It is the most reasonable conclusion. We can infer that coded or semi-coded language was used in communications, not because it's dramatic, but because the record's abbreviations and euphemisms function like a code. They conceal meaning while coordinating action. If a patrol route instruction relies on shorthand, the message becomes readable only to insiders. That creates operational security, and it also creates the possibility of manipulation, because manipulation thrives where outsiders cannot verify. And this is the heart of the matter. We can infer, with careful confidence, that someone close to paper interfered with a dispatch during a peak manhunt window. Why? Because we have a procedural note, corrected prior to dispatch, in proximity to a cutout section in a letter copybook. Because we have a private transcription from later decades noting a missing word in a directive line. Because we have oral fragments about the writers went wrong and a letterman who could read. Because the system's reaction in 1937 suggests the material did not merely record brutality, it recorded vulnerability. And because the patrol apparatus, by design, depends on written directives. A patrol that obeys paper can be misled by paper. That is not a romantic claim. That is an operational fact. Do we know the exact word? No. That is where the institution's erasure succeeds. A missing word could be a place name, a direction, a timing marker, any small term that shifts a search corridor. Upper instead of lower. West instead of north. A creek name swapped for a road name. The point is not the specific syllables. The point is that one small alteration can redirect men on horseback for hours. And in a manhunt, hours are a lifetime. Do we know the exact count? 40. The number survives because human memory clings to round figures when paper refuses to count. 40 may be literal. 40 may be an approximation. But here is what we can infer. The escape involved a large enough group to generate panic, correspondence spikes, replacement requests, and later confrontation letters demanding accountability. The system does not mobilize at that intensity for a single person. It mobilizes when control feels threatened. So whether the number was 32 or 47, the moral fact remains. Dozens moved through a corridor created by sabotage inside the paperwork pipeline. And if you need an exact number to care, you have already been trained by the archive to value precision over human life. Don't make that mistake. Now, what remains unknown? These unknowns are not the natural limits of history. They are the product of choices. Names remain unknown because enslaved people were recorded as property, not persons. Burial sites remain unknown because bodies were handled under restriction or off the books. The fate of individuals remains unknown because sent away was written without destination. We do not have the full patrol log because pages were cut. We do not have the full incident record because it was likely kept separate and never filed. We do not have the master's complete correspondence because private papers were preserved selectively, what made families look good, not what made them complicit. That is the moral truth. Institutional reputation was protected at human cost, and the protection continued long after the original crime. In the 1850s, the county protected slavery. In 1937, it protected the county's image. In 1977, it protected access and funding by pressuring a historian to delete a chapter. In 2008, it protected itself with technical language that discouraged disturbance. Same decision. Different decade. Different costume. So what do we do with this? We return to the beginning. To that courthouse basement in 1937. To Thomas Weller's hands on a mislabeled bundle. To the clean cutouts. To the phrase, corrected prior to dispatch. The institution wanted that moment to die in the dark. It didn't. Because someone, somewhere, kept a line. Someone refused to let the record be fully erased. That refusal is the only reason we can speak at all. And now, we close with the names that refuse to disappear. Not because the archive preserved them, but because they survived in fragments, the human archive. Elijah Cade's name is a reconstruction, a stand-in for a man the system refused to name properly. But we name him anyway because naming is a moral act. Names are what the institution tried to strip away first. To say hand instead of man. Property instead of person. Removed instead of killed. If we accept that language, we become participants in the erasure. So, here is the symbol I want you to hold on to. A single line of ink where a word should be, and isn't. A blank space that once bent a patrol's path. That blank space is not just absence. It is evidence of struggle. It is the trace of a human intelligence operating under the threat of annihilation. It is proof that the oppressed were not passive. They read. They listened. They learned the master's codes, and in one decisive moment, they used that knowledge to create a corridor of life. The institution built a system where paper was law and bodies were inventory. Elijah used the same paper to save people from becoming ledger substitutions. And the institution's response, then and later, was to bury the proof and demand silence. That demand still echoes every time a modern report says, "We recommend against excavation." Every time a clerk says, "Misfiled." Every time a publisher says, "Remove that section." We are not obligated to obey that echo. We are obligated to remember, to reconstruct, to record what they refuse to count. If you're listening from a place with an old courthouse, a plantation road, a port town, a river crossing, comment where you're from. And if you have a theory about the missing word, say it. Not because speculation is entertainment, but because speaking is how we break the policy of silence. The names they erased do not disappear by themselves. They disappear when we allow it.